Well, welcome to the Hall County Historical Society virtual cemetery tour. This is the first time we've done a virtual tour ever in the 20 years that we've been doing cemetery tours, but we're calling this the COVID edition. This is going to be a really short, brief introduction to what we actually do on the cemetery tours. We do invite you all to come out to our cemetery tour on October 17th. We're going to have tours again. We're hoping we'll be able to be together again, but right now, social distancing, it's really hard to stay apart and be able to hear one another and what we're saying. So right now, we're gonna do this virtually, but we hope to see you all in October. So to get started, welcome to the Grand Island City Cemetery. This is actually the oldest part of the city cemetery. The cemetery was established in the 1860s by Grand Island attorneys George Thummel and William Platt. They actually owned all of this land that we're standing on today, and they sold lots to individuals for cemetery plots. Most cemeteries originally were, if they weren't associated with the church, it was something similar to this where it was a private setup and individuals owned the land and they sold the plots to people. So in the 1860s, like I said, George Thummel and William Platt established this side of the cemetery. It's just to the east of the GAR cemetery. So if you've ever driven up Stolly Park or up Shady Webb Road by Snow's Floral, that side over there actually was a separate cemetery. That was the GAR cemetery. So if you were a soldier in the Civil War, you could have been buried over there. So they established their cemetery just to the east. Of course, over time, it's all grown together. So in 1887, there was a huge storm that came up and blew down the maintenance shed, and the only record of plots that were sold out here. There was a notice put in the paper asking people to please contact the cemetery office if you found the book. The records were never found. So in 1897, when the city of Grand Island actually decided to buy this cemetery from Thummel and Platt and the 40 acres across the road, there was kind of limited record keeping at the time. So they actually had notices in the paper asking people to come to City Hall if they owned plots out here, so they could figure out who owned plots and where people were buried. Again, that's really kind of spotty record keeping. If you'll notice, when you come out here on the south side of Stolly Park Road, all of the roads run east and west in straight lines. On the north side of the road, it's more of a wagon wheel design. So come out and we'll tell you a little bit more about that next time. But I wanted to actually start here today. Thummel and Platt themselves are not buried in this cemetery. They're actually buried somewhere else, but they have family members that are buried here, including this one right here. This is Peter Smith. This was George Thummel's father-in-law. Now, Peter Smith, he was actually from New York originally, and he loaded his whole family and went to California to the gold mines to try to make his fortune, and that's where his youngest daughter, Lena, was born. And Lena, actually, Sue will talk about her in just a second, but her claim to fame was she was the first white child born in Alameda County, I believe it's Alameda County, California. The other claim to fame that the Smith family has is Peter Smith is actually the brother of famed mountain man Jedediah Smith. So it's interesting to note that we have a connection right here in Grand Island City Cemetery. There's all kinds of history all around us, and that's kind of what we tried to do on the cemetery tours, is share a little bit of the community history with people as they're out here. And Sue has something to say about Lena Smith, Peter's daughter.
Right, she had the distinction, it was mentioned in her obituary, that she had crossed the plains 3 times. And today we don't think much of going to California or whatever, but she was born in California, came back to Grand Island and married Mr. Thummel, George Thummel, and then in her later life she had, well, wasn't much later, she was in her 30s, but her health failed and he took her back to California, and so that was her second trip, and she died in California and George brought her back here to be buried. So she passed over the plains 3 times, which in the 1880s, 70s, and 80s was quite a feat. And Lena I think I found a biography of George in which it said he was a Presbyterian, but Lena at least was an Episcopalian. And the large stained glass window in the south side of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church on 2nd Street was given in her memory by her husband, George Thummel. So her name still survives here in Grand Island.
And like I said, Platt wasn't buried here either. However, his father is buried just a few rows down. Both Mr. Smith, the father-in-law of George Thummel, and William Platt, who was the father of William Platt, are both buried here. They're both buried in about the 1870s. William Platt Sr. actually was also known as Uncle Platt and was a man that was adored by many, and it was actually well known as Uncle Platt. And when his obituary, it was written that he was the sunshine of the city. And when he passed, he actually died of typhoid fever. He was very hale and hearty one minute when he had come back from his home state of Michigan to Nebraska, and then shortly after he succumbed to the pandemic of typhoid that was in the area at the time. So also, one of the things you'll see on the cemetery tours is what we call dowsing or divining. It's how we can actually find graves. And there's a couple different things that we can do with dowsing. We can find where graves are, we can find if they're adults or if they're children's graves, and we can actually tell gender also. When you come out in October, we'll be able to show you a little bit more about dowsing and let you actually hopefully have a try at trying dowsing yourself. So with that, like I said, we know that there are more people buried out here than there are stones. Right here in this area, we see 2 stones. But I'm going to go ahead and douse across here, and I'm going to have Sue count it off, and we'll tell you how many people are actually buried right here in this row. All right, Sue, count me off.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8.
Another thing that we see on cemetery tours all the time is we talk about symbolism of graves and what graves can tell us. So we're going to head over here and show you some really good examples of symbols on graves and what you can expect on a cemetery tour. So stones, especially old stones, have a lot of character, and they can really tell us a lot about the individuals buried there. They can tell us, of course, when they were born, when they died, possibly when they were married, their names, but there's symbols usually on a stone, especially the older stones, that will give you more clues to the individual and what maybe organizations they belonged to, what occupation they had, if they had military service, what their religious beliefs were. This first stone here that we're going to talk about is one that you've probably seen at the cemetery. There's multiple variations on this stone. This stone that looks like a tree that's just sprung out of the ground, a stone tree, was actually tells us that Mr. Meth here, he was a member of the organization Woodmen of the World. So if you belonged to Woodmen of the World, it was an insurance agency, you paid your policy, and at your death, you could have a marker that looked like this. They would actually carve a stone for you. The interesting things about the Woodmen of the World markers is if there are branches that are protruding from the tree, it'll tell you how many children survived after the parent passed away. If the branches are shorn off at the tree, it'll tell you how many children did not survive. The parents died after the children died. So Mr. Meth here, he actually had 6 children. There are 3 children, so there are 3 limbs that are sticking out of the tree that survived him, and 3 that passed away before him. So there's shorn off branches as well. The other thing we can tell about Mr. Meth here is he was a Christian. Down at the bottom of his stone here, he has a Holy Bible carved into his stone, and he was a Mason. He's got the symbol of the Mason organization on his stone as well. The interesting thing also about him is this is his second stone. He has 2 stones out here. He and his wife both have pillars or columns off to the side here. A column is usually representative of someone who was a pillar of a community or a family. So Mr. Meth, he actually has 2 different stones out here, the Woodmen of the World and another one similar to his wife's stone. Over here, On the mows, we have some really good examples of symbols that you'll see out here at the cemetery. One of them is the clasped hands. A clasped hand is used to represent a spouse who is welcoming the other spouse into heaven. Usually it depends on the cuff around the hand underneath will tell you which spouse passed away first. If it's more of a frilly or lacy cuff, it would be the wife. If it's more of a crisp cuff like a man's cuff, it would be the husband. So the one underneath is the spouse who passed away first, welcoming their spouse into heaven. So when you see clasped hand, that's what that means. The mows also have some really good examples of stones that you'll see representing children. There are a lot of children's graves out here. A lot of lives were cut short. And usually on a child stone, you'll see something like a lamb, which is right here. You might see a rose, which is the far side there. And then we also have a praying child. A dove is also another great example of what you might find on a child's grave to indicate a symbol. And when you're talking about the lambs, when you come out to our tour, ask us how we can tell how old the child is just by the picture of the lamb on the stone without even looking at the date of death. Also, stones, like I said, will tell you about people's military history. Back behind me here, the Schwartzes, Leroy and Anna Schwartz. If you can see, they both have brass eagle emblems on their grave. That tells us that they were in the military. It specifically tells us they were in World War II. And the interesting thing about the Schwartzes is there's actually 2 brass eagles there because both Leroy and Anna were in the military. Leroy was a sergeant in the Army during World War II, and Anna was a corporal in the U.S. Air Corps. You'll see other stones out here that indicate if people were soldiers of the Civil War. There's different stones for Civil War veterans that were on the Union side, Civil War veterans on the Confederate side. You'll see stones representing the Spanish-American War, of course, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, and then there's also American Legion emblems. So there's so much that we can tell without really knowing that person's history just from the stones that we see. Off to the side over here too, there's a stone Candish. On his stone, it actually says he was born in Scotland, but he has the Mason marker on his as well. So again, if you belong to some kind of a fraternal organization, you would often have some kind of emblem on your stone to tell you that as well.
Well, this magnificent stone is the stone for Fred Wiebe, and he, along with Mr. Koenig, started the OK Store, which was one of the early stores in Grand Island. It was located approximately where the Fauner Park concourse is, and it was later moved up to the town when the railroad came through. Then the town that was original was too far away, so it was moved. But this is one of the stones that the Historical Society has paid to have refurbished. There's a picture on our Facebook page of how it started out, which is, it was approaching Leaning Tower of Pisa angle. And that's okay for the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but not for Mr. Wiebe's stone. And so we paid to have it repaired and replaced, and that's expensive. It cost about $1,000 for this one to be repaired and replaced and set up straight. And where did we get the money? Well, that's where our admissions fee to come to the cemetery tours, that's one of the places where that goes. So I think we can all agree that this would be a bad thing if this stone went down, because it's quite lovely. And of course, Mr. Wiebe was one of the early settlers here, early businessmen here in Grand Island.
So if you've been out on a cemetery tour the past few years, you'll know that we have interpreters now. We actually have live interpreters giving first-person accounts of the people that are buried there. If you haven't been out on a cemetery tour in a while, come check it out, because it's a lot of fun to actually hear someone speaking as though they were that person buried there and telling you their life story. So this year on the cemetery tour, we were actually coming back to the south side of the road. The past 2 years we've been on the north. We're coming back to south side. And our theme this year, we have a theme every year, our theme was different viewpoints. We were going to have interpreters at various graves, including this one. This is Maggie Mobley. She was the first editor in the state of Nebraska, first female editor in the state of Nebraska, and she founded what is today known as the Grand Island Independent. And Maggie was, she came to Grand Island in 1870 after a brief stint in North Platte, and we'll talk about that in the cemetery tour if you come out. We don't want to give too much away, but she came to Grand Island in 1870. As some of you recall, the first group of settlers came in 1857. They were Germans who came to establish this community. Two of them we also had as interpreters. On the other side of the road here, Fred Hetty was one of them, and William Stolley was another one we're going to have live interpreters for. Grand Island and Hall County is really fortunate because, as we said, there are all kinds of stories to be found in the cemetery, but we actually have a lot of written records, and those written records are because we have a lot of prolific writers in the community. Maggie Mobley, obviously having the Independent, was one of those writers. Fred Hetty, he actually bought the Independent later on, so he operated the Independent after the Mobleys. And before he came to the United States, he was actually a journalist in Germany. In fact, Karl Marx, who you might remember from the Communist Manifesto, had spoken out against Fred Hetty and his writings back in Germany. So Fred Hetty was a very prolific writer. Maggie was a very prolific writer. And William Stolley, who wrote the book, The First Settlement of Hall County, who was also one of the Germans that came in that 1857 group, was a very prolific writer. However, everyone had a different viewpoint. Everyone had a different lens or perspective in which they viewed the world through. So their stories, while set in the same point of time, were a little bit different. So that's one of the things we wanted to share with you on the cemetery tour this year, is how each one of these individuals lived in the same period of time here in Grand Island and Hall County, but each one had a different perspective and viewpoint on the world, and we wanted to share a little bit of that with you. So if you come out in October, you'll be able to see first person William Stolley talking to you, Fred Hetty talking to you, and Maggie Mobley talking to you about their own perspectives, viewpoints, and the contributions that they believe that they made here in Grand Island and Hall County.
Well, here we are at the stone of the Bartenbach family in Grand Island, and the Bartenbachs were here and opened their photography shop, or a shop like that, in 1880, and they just went, the fifth generation just closed the business and retired just a couple of years ago. So they have been around for a long time. Their daughter, Ella Bartenbach, married Othman Abbott Jr. He's the son of Othman Abbott Sr. and Elizabeth Abbott, and the Abbotts are well known in the social services nationwide. But Ella married the first son, Othman Abbott Jr., and they had a child, Charlotte. And it's kind of interesting because we had planned to stop at the Bartenbachs this year anyway, because Ella had died in the flu pandemic of 1918, and we thought that was an interesting fact that she had done that. And unlike most daughters-in-law who bear the name of their husband, she was not buried in her husband's plot. I don't know why that is. I wonder, because she was quite young when she passed away, maybe they assumed that he would remarry and there'd be another Mrs. Abbott, but he'd never remarried. But Ella passed away of the flu at the age of 33 in 1918. Her husband, according to the newspaper, her husband and their 3-year-old daughter Charlotte were also ill in the pandemic, but they did recover. So the Bartenbachs, I just thought it was ironic that we were going to do Ella, and here came the pandemic, roaring along to bring it along to today's news as well. Well, the pandemic put a stop to our having the cemetery tours in over the Memorial Day weekend this year, but Michelle and I have crossed our fingers and rescheduled for Saturday, October 17th. And we hope we can have the full cemetery tour then. There will be 2 on that day. So we have just given you an overview of some of the people, and definitely just an overview of this wonderful cemetery. So I hope you'll all come out in October 17th, and you'll see the enlarged version of our cemetery tour.